Hello, everybody, and welcome to this webinar slash panel discussion put on by the Maynard Institute and featuring all of our lovely panelists who we will introduce in just a moment. I'm just going to introduce Juan Michael Porter II, Maynard 200 alum and Director of Communications for the HIV Caucus and PWN, sorry. And we're just going to take it away real quick. We have a very stacked panel talking about belonging and investment in queer news and queer communities. So take it away, Juan Michael Porter II.
Thank you so much, everyone. And I always say this to people because I want to know who you're talking to. I'm a Black gay man living with HIV in the middle of Brooklyn, and I'm thrilled to host today's panel, Beyond Allyship, True Belonging and Investment in Queer News and Communities. Our fabulous panel, which is stacked with some of the best writers out there, include Tre'vell Anderson, they, them, Executive Director of Trans Journalists Association, Petrin, they, them, co-founder of Trans Journalists Association, Joseph Jaafari, he, him, editor-in-chief of Lookout News, Phillip Zonkel, he, him, editor-in-chief of Q Voice News, Ken Miguel, he, him, national board president of the Association of LGBTQ+ journalists, and Jireh Deng, they, them, co-founder of Asian American Journalists Association's LGBTQIA+ affinity group. Instead of doing any preamble, we're going to dive right into it. And Joseph, you are up. Here we go. Tell us how Lookout stays solutions and community oriented, and what does Lookout want people to understand about the importance of investing in queer news?
So there's a few different answers to that because I wouldn't say that we are really primarily focused on being solutions oriented. So we're an accountability news outlet based in the Southwest. And when we first started, we were going to just purely do accountability news and kind of say screw it to all the other kinds of news out there. There's plenty of fluffy out there for us to for other people to cover. But then we quickly learned after we surveyed our community the fact that we surveyed 1,200 people and they all kind of said we want good news. And as the investigator in me, I kind of want to chew on glass whenever I hear that. But we kind of figured out, we dug deeper and they all kind of said, well, we want something to do. More than anything, we don't just want to hear the baker that's doing something in their neighborhood. We want to actually know how to get involved. So what I kept hearing was civic engagement. So we ultimately changed our model from, just a newsroom to also a bit of an events company at the same time. So half of our mission is to get out accountability news, like the deep dive stuff, the ProPublica style, find the record, turn it around, get the accountability. But then half of our other mission is events. So we put on over 40 events a year with a very limited budget. But essentially all it is to get people into a room and get them engaged in either, voting, issues they care about, or even just it could even be something simple, like we're doing a dance party this weekend type of thing, right? But the entire idea is that in order for people to actually feel like they're a part of a community, which is what the biggest problem is right now, is people feel sequestered into their own communities. The L, the G, the B, it's all sequestered to each other, is to get them into one room. And then they can know their neighbors, they can know who they're fighting for, they can know exactly who these stories are about. So there's that. And then also we have really been maintained to make sure that we do a print publication that is all service journalism. So our publication that just printed today, actually, it's our summer edition, is all voting information. It's games, it's, tear outs, it's making mini zines, it's making sure that to look out for poll watchers or what they look like, how to identify in somebody's illegally electioneering, and it's making it fun, making civic engagement fun. And so that's been half of the mission, with the other half of being accountability news. And the importance of that is we see that it's working. We started Lookout as a bit of an FU to the establishment that didn't want to bring this on to the legacy organizations. We said that queer news needs to be treated its own beat. It can't be something that is just something where you just dive into a diversity database and say, oh, I fixed it. Our issues as a community, encompass a wide range of problems in the same way that you cover, same way that you cover police and prisons, same that you cover education, health, all those sort of things, right? And so we kind of set out that you need to treat this community as its own beat and treat it firmly in the same way that you would do in any other newsroom. And it's worked. It's worked dramatically. We're expanding into Colorado this year outside of Arizona. Our print publication has gone from 500 to 4,000 a quarter. We have to now increase that to 5,000 a quarter because people keep asking for more. And our subscriptions are up, our views are up, everything is up. And it shows that if you actually treat this beat with the the care and the empathy it deserves, the community will not only start going back to news, they'll start really engaging with it as well.
What I'm hearing there is when you engage people, they care about what you're doing, and then they like feed into it or like actually going to use the resources you provide.
Yeah, because you're not a face behind a typewriter at that point or a screen. You are essentially in the community with them, and that's all people want. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
reason why local news has been continued to be the most trusting of like news outlets over the past decades or so, even though national news outlets have got lost trust. It's because at the end of the day, even though local news is kind of flailing a bit, people are still seeing the reporters in their neighborhoods.
Yeah.
And so it's treating it the same way.
Thank you for that. Such a complete answer. And now, Tre'vell Anderson, my favorite. In your book, We See Each Other, a Black trans journey through TV and film, you talk about the misperception that Laverne Cox is the first trans woman when we know that Black and trans people have existed forever. So why do people fail to see Black and trans people in their own communities, even when they're in front of them? And how can we get folks to understand that queer people exist everywhere and every day, and not just in Hollywood when it's convenient? And I just asked you to solve like cancer with that question. Go off.
Yes, you did, beloved. I think something that Joseph just said actually really applies here, which is that like people care about who and what is happening in their community, right? They actually do care about their neighbors. I think part of the problem is a lot of people believe that we're not their neighbors, right? They believe that we don't live in their communities. They believe that trans people are not already present, right? In their everyday lives. And so because of that, right, the media, the news that people consume becomes all that much more important. And so I find it quite interesting, what you mentioned, Joseph, about, folks' trust, right? At least being greater or higher with, the local news outlets, the local anchors, the local reporters who people can touch at community events, who they can talk to at the coffee shop, who they can, rub elbows with at the dive bar down the street. And also we know that in those spaces, a lot of those outlets could be doing better, right, about representing the fullness of their communities, right, about making sure that trans people are incorporated in their reporting, not just during Trans Day of Visibility or Trans Day of Remembrance or Pride Month, right, but 365, because of the ways that we live, love, and exist in every shape, form, and part of life. And so I think that's like the tip of the iceberg. There's a host of other institutional issues, right, and systemic barriers and issues that also impact how Black people and queer people and trans people and those of us at the intersections of all of those identities, get rendered in media, in news, and therefore in the minds, right, of our neighbors.
Mm. This could be an hour-long conversation, obviously. I guess I do have a bit of a follow-up there. Sometimes I think there's this idea of like, well, I don't know any Black trans people, so they must not exist. When it's like, but do you want to know? And so I'm curious, like, how do you like engage with that of just among your peers, people who'll be like, this isn't even an issue for us because it's not affecting anyone I know.
Yeah, well, I often say that, the reason why so many people believe that they've never met a trans person or that that trans people are not in their communities is because they haven't made their communities safe enough for the trans people who are already there to say, hey, this is who I am, right? And so what can we all be doing to pursue, allyship and accompliceship even if folks of difference aren't present, right? What can we be doing in advance? Like if we do indeed believe that trans people and Black trans people specifically are not our neighbors, are not in our communities, that the issues impacting them are not our issues, what can we be doing? And that they're not our issues because they're not a part of our communities. What can we be doing to make our communities safe and welcoming and inclusive for when those people theoretically do, come to let others in to the fullness of who they are. I think that looks like, policies around access to public space, right? Whether or not there's a trans person trying to use the bathroom, that aligns with their gender or not, right? What does it look like for cis people to intervene and intercede, right, without having a specific individual to tie that work towards, and instead be motivated by just like, humanity, right? And building connections and relationships with the people around us. I hope I hit that.
You did, and it brings us back to the fact that like safety and representation and visibility, because it's the right thing to do and because it makes all of us safe. Thank you so much. Jireh, you've reported on everything from immigration and public safety to Asian elders and trans elders and health and environment. So how do you make queer people apparent and obvious in journalism where folks aren't thinking, how does this affect queer people? I mean, it affects all of us, but sometimes it's like, is that a queer issue? Please.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for this thoughtful question. I think that I go back to the idea of intersectionality coined by Kimberly Crenshaw and the idea that, we as people living in this world have different vulnerabilities and compounding vulnerabilities based on our identities. And whether you're covering housing, whether you're covering the job market or immigration or criminal justice or environmental pollution, queer people are oftentimes even more impacted than their peers for various different reasons. So, for an example, research has shown that only around 4.5% of the general population identifies as LGBTQ. But if you look at the homeless youth population in the United States, that number rises to about 40%, right? Homelessness is an issue that deeply affects queer and trans youth, especially trans youth of color. And when it comes to economics, me and my friends joke that every barista in LA is like non-binary. But the fact of the matter is that why are there so many unemployed like trans and non-binary people, right? We know that there's research from the Center for American Progress that like LGBTQ individuals were impacted by job losses harder during the pandemic, right? So we have to ask ourselves, like, what types of experiences are people having in terms of employment discrimination, housing discrimination, right? And so, and when it comes to immigration, there are a lot of people seeking asylum in the US because they are persecuted on the basis of their gender or sexuality. And when it came to covering the LA wildfires, I was doing research and was flagged by an editor that there was some recovery spaces in Pasadena, Altadena that were really close to the wildfires, and it felt like there could be a story there. And so ended up I interviewed people at Serenity House, which was the first TGI centered substance use recovery space in LA County, or maybe even in Southern California, that focused on that population. And I found a story there that was more than just about the wildfires, but about people's story of survival and healing, and how this space had narrowly survived a huge wildfire that had burned down entire neighborhoods. And recently I've been also working at LA Public Press, writing a lot about the criminal justice system writing about sex workers who are surveilled by the police and law enforcement and abused in those systems as well. And trans people and queer people are overwhelmingly participating in sex work. And I think those issues about all these different areas often intersect with queer identities. And to be honest, like I had no idea that there were so many queer people in sex work when I started reporting. So all of these issues intersect with each other. And I think if you are covering any of these beats, queer people are at the heart of the story as well.
Yes, it really does speak to disenfranchisement. And I think people forget that when you're harming the most vulnerable population, that you are also harming yourself when you are opened up to vulnerability. These issues around homelessness, at any point, anyone in this country can lose their housing, their jobs, and being in that same situation. So why wouldn't we want to make it better for those who are the most harmed? Thank you so much for your answer and thoughtfulness on this. Kay, you've done a lot of reporting on anti-queer legislation, and so much of that is caused by scapegoating and false moral panic. So what are the other things you wish news organizations were covering or gathering information and data on?
I think for me, the biggest gap in coverage that I'm seeing in the policy space right now is that we have these very granular daily stories, right, of this law has been passed. And we have these very big picture stories about 500 laws have been passed over X period of time. But we're missing a lot of those sort of more granular big picture looks that actually ask, what is this doing? What are the consequences? What's happening because of these laws? So we now have laws in many states that have been on the books for a year, 2 years. They have long public records trails. We can go look at, has someone been arrested and put in prison because of this law? Have schools been dealing with fines or lawsuits because of this law? Or has this law just served that purpose of scapegoating? They're not enforcing it. It's caused all this disruption. It's scared people. It has these consequences, but it's not being enforced in the way that we might have expected, right? A lot of those questions, I think, are some of the most important questions of like what's actually happening in people's lives, in trans and queer people's lives on the ground because of these massive changes in policy and law. And so digging into some of those more just like concrete investigative accountability and as sort of Joseph is also speaking about solutions, right? There's this law on the books. What is happening because of it? What can we do about that? What does that look like? What are communities doing for mutual aid? A lot of those just like concrete consequence questions are questions that journalists can and should be doing a better job of answering. So I think a lot of the coverage has sort of dealt with this as sort of like a very big picture, philosophical, zoomed out, uh, political concept rather than something that has concrete outcomes and concrete consequences that we can dig into. Um, and so I think that's like where I hope to see more work. Like I want to see people go check how many people have been charged with trespassing as these new more severe bathroom laws are going into effect. I want to see more work that differentiates between laws that are actively criminalizing people, putting people into jail and prison, versus laws that are sort of toothless or have fines and civil penalties that take much longer and much more complicated to enforce. That sort of like picture that actually affects people's lives so they know, am I safe in this space? What's going on in my state, in my school district, etc. Like, those are the stories that I think we really need to be looking to right now.
That reminds us that without context and action, the data is quite useless. And Kay, I think that I'm sorry, Kay, Jireh, I think I interrupted you and moved on. You were about to say something, I think, and I wanted to come back and give you an opportunity. Oh, okay, good. Just making sure. Um,
I did want to say one thing.
Please.
I think that when it comes to covering a lot of different issues across America, I think that trans people are kind of like the canary in the coal mine.
Yes.
And I think going back to what Kay is saying, talking about anti-trans legislation, it doesn't just impact trans people, it also impacts a lot of cisgender kids. Like maybe you have a daughter who is a tomboy who wants to play on the track team, and now you have coaches and parents wondering, well, why is your daughter so good at track? Why is she so good at basketball? Why is she so tall? And suddenly there are questions to see your cisgender child's genitalia, right? Like these are issues that when trans people are impacted, it actually has huge ripple effects on everyone else. So I just wanted to add that one point to kind of note that because yeah, I think that we should be covering issues about trans people because it affects everyone.
Yes, and that reminds me that when people are attacking trans women, and specifically, it's not that they hate trans women, they hate all women. And it's just a cudgel that's being used to destroy anyone who doesn't subscribe to a very specific and narrow perspective of maleness and specifically white masculinity. But moving forward, Ken, what are you seeing on a national scale in terms of investment from typical outlets covering queer stories? And is there enough data surrounding what queer journalists need from the newsrooms and what queer communities need from the news?
To answer your first two questions, no and no. Um,
Say more.
uh, no, real quick, just to build on what you were just talking about, I think that it is the success that the LGB community has had over the years is part of what the attack on trans people is an undoing of all those advances that LGB people have made, as well as attack on women. It it's it's much bigger than just an attack on transgender people, and I agree that it is something that we need to monitor closely because of that. And is it happening in national newsrooms? Absolutely not. I think that there is conversations in those newsrooms, but is it making it onto air or is it making it onto the front page? Not in the way that it should, because the national organizations have a national audience. So unlike the local papers and local news outlets, they are capturing the voice of people in their communities and having these neighbor to neighbor conversations, of like the lesbian couple who puts up a rainbow flag in front of their house and the next door neighbor who puts up a Trump flag, to counter that. And, the conversations they're having about that, it opens up an opportunity for dialogue on a very personal community level. When you're looking at national publications, you don't see that as much because the audience is so big and so divided across this country that you can't have those conversations in the same intimate kind of way. So that's why local news is succeeding where national is failing. I think, and that it looks like from the nodding, everybody agrees with me. So that's a good sign. I think that there's more conversations happening in newsrooms at the national level? Absolutely, because we know from NLGJA, the Association of LGBTQ Journalists, that we have members at every newsroom across this country, and they're telling us about the conversations that are happening. So they're the first line of defense. And a lot of times when these stories come up, so often they'll raise an issue about how something's going to be covered or whether it should be covered. And most often, the people are saying at the management level, this is too controversial. We're just going to skip it. So the national conversation gets shut down on it. So I think that's where we need to focus some more energy. It doesn't help that the President of the United States is attacking national organizations and threatening their licenses. And I work for ABC. I'm one of those folks that their license is being threatened. So, it when you have that conversation going on over you, it makes it impossible to make an alternative. That's by design. And basically it piggybacks onto what everybody else was saying. Not having the conversation means it's pushing it to the back of not having conversations about abortion and women's rights is pushing the conversation to the back. We have a history in this country of journalists driving this conversation. If you go back to the 1950s, it was the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis that in the 1960s that created publications that spawned the conversation and let LGBT people know that they were not alone. You fast forward to the great what that Monica Roberts did of like driving the conversation forward on trans rights. There were writers in the 40s writing about trans issues. We know that having the conversation is a threat to the larger conservative movement that wants to strip away rights from people and make this a very cisgender white society. Uh, I think that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's sort of the dissidence analysis that New York Times, and not just New York Times, but their coverage had a specifically anti-trans perspective. I guess my follow-up would be
Well, and
when you
actually,
have, please.
I want to talk about the New York Times because you know, Transgender Journalists Association and NLGJA have had conversations with the New York Times, and I do think that some of their opinion coverage is extremely problematic, and the fact that it's being quoted in lawsuits is problematic, and that's part of the strategy is to get the word out so that those things could be used as fact when they're undisputed as undisputed facts. But those organizations are willing to have the conversations with us and sit down in the same room and talk about things. And I know from the folks I talk to at the New York Times, they have trans people in their newsroom. They want more, but that it just creates an issue now where they're seen as anti-trans, and people who are trans don't want to work there because they don't think it's a friendly environment. So that's part of the strategy. So it's like it's a whittling away. We kind of have to peel back the layers, and unfortunately, and I remember this, from covering things in the '90s when HIV and AIDS was still very much a fear factor, and people wrote about HIV and AIDS to be something that was scary, and therefore gay men were scary because they had this disease, and it made it so that we couldn't have real legitimate conversations about moving rights forward because these people were seen as dirty or seen as they were othered. So I know having the conversations with New York Times has been very progressive. Now, Fox News used to have a handful of people in their newsroom that were LGBT, and they would be the people who stood up for things. Those people aren't there anymore. I know one person left at Fox News who's publicly out, and he says he's given up. It's not worth fighting anymore because they're not. He's not going to change anything. He's not going to move the needle. It's like that is their way that they're going to cover our community. They've gotten better on covering the gay community and not calling us pedophiles and calling us. Uh, they had something.
It doesn't bear repeating.
It doesn't bear repeating. Yeah, we had conversations with them in their newsroom, and they understood, why, and many LGBT people are victims of sexual violence and of child abuse, and it's offensive to accuse them of being their perpetrators. So I think that the conversation has. But our country is so divided, and our national news is so divided that it has made the emphasis on local be so much more important to the national dialogue.
Thank you. And this segues perfectly into Tre'vell's next question. Can you tell us more about the Trans News Initiative and its purpose? And do you find that outlets are really understanding the effects of their reporting or misreporting on trans people? And do they care?
Ooh, you with these big questions. So I first would like to tap on that New York Times discourse piece that Ken was bringing up. I think largely because, at least for me in the work that we're doing at TJA, I'm less interested in focusing on the specific violations, I would call them, that the New York Times has committed in their news and opinion coverage of trans rights and communities, and focusing on how this kind of behavior and reporting and sentimentality around, right, what the role of journalists should be in this moment is actually much bigger than just the New York Times itself, right? A lot of the work that we're doing is pushing against these long-held systems and beliefs in our industry of journalism, right, that are manifesting through a host of outlets, right? And their policies and their standards around coverage. And so the Trans News Initiative is a first of its kind data visualization tool that we developed and released late last year that tracks how mainstream news is covering trans rights and communities. It is a data set that goes back to 2020 and it is updated every single month. So it is both kind of an archive of how the industry has covered trans rights and communities over the last 5 years, 6 years. And now also, we're getting, as in real time information as we can get about what coverage is happening and what coverage is not happening. When I think about harm, right? When you ask about the impact of journalists and reporting, misreporting, misinformation. When I think about harm in journalism, I don't think people are thinking about what that looks like and how that impacts trans communities, because they're also not thinking about how our work as journalists impacts other historically excluded communities, right? Where we institutionally most often in this industry aren't thinking about how our reporting is impacting immigrant communities, how it's impacting, undocumented people, how it's impacting, diverse historically excluded people, including trans folks, including Black folks, etc. And so we are also institutionally speaking and structurally speaking, not thinking about the ways that reporting and the misinformation that often spreads through reporting, impacts the communities on the other end. And I would say also help push anti-trans sentiment and anti-trans policies and efforts by reproducing and kind of undergirding and emboldening a lot of the ignorance that people have about trans people broadly. And I don't say ignorance to be pejorative. I mean to say people believe they don't know us, right? And when people believe they don't know you or don't know a community, the kind of efforts that have to be done to build those bridges become that much more important. And so the Trans News Initiative, allows us to be able to engage in these conversations and identify a host of trends about what is happening, what is being covered, and what is not being covered, right? And so I can sit here and say to you that I know that more headlines, more articles have been written about Dave Chappelle and his anti-trans comedy than there have been about the ways that we as trans community are, resisting and responding and taking care of each other in a moment such as this, right? And so then hopefully those data points that we're able to pull from this initiative serve as a mirror, right, for the industry at large, to hopefully begin thinking differently about what and how their coverage impacts, individuals on the community level, as well as on this kind of like broader collective level in terms of how it not only impacts us, but also impacts them as well. I will say out loud, the brainchild, this project is the brainchild of Kay, before and our partners at Polygraph and the University of Miami School of Communication. So if you want to say anything about the TNI, Kay, jump in. But it is something that we developed coming out of a lot of these conversations we had with newsrooms in which they were like, prove it. Prove that we're not covering trans rights and communities. Prove that we are, proliferating or spreading misinformation. Prove that we are focused on more on these, pop cultural culture war discussions as opposed to the truths and realities and complexities of trans life. And now we're able to do that, right, in a data-based way, not just in the lived experience way that many of us as journalists and as trans people have experienced.
One, Michael,
Thank
I'm just going to jump in real quick.
Please.
After some technical difficulties, our last panelist, Phillip Zonkel, him of Q Voice News, has been able to join us. So if we have a question for Phillip, let's jump to that if we can.
Awesome, please. And thank you. And welcome, Phillip. Happy to have you here. Could you speak about Q News, the effect that your reporting has had on community and what happens when other news outlets consider certain items to be done with, or when mainstream outlets sort of move on and leave queer news behind?
So for Q Voice News, I mean, the impact we've had, we're the only digital local queer newsroom in the entire LA County region. So it was a huge footprint for us to cover that possibly even goes as far as Southern California. And I think it's fair to say, similar to what I think Tre'vell said, mainstream media covers a lot of, what do we want to call it, like the pop culture outrage. But when it comes to the serious journalism stuff, it's not. And, the impact that we've had, I'd say probably more than 80% of our original coverage is not covered by the mainstream. Those articles, they just don't cover them. And a lot of these stories are stories that are right out there. It's not like I had to go dig under a rock and then dig under the ground and follow a tunnel. I mean, it's right there. Just basic journalism skills would take you to that. And so, for the queer community here in Long Beach and beyond, I mean, the impact is they're being informed and being told of things they would not have known otherwise, whether it's regarding the Long Beach Police Department's history of falsely arresting gay men for over 100 years, whether it's our local LGBTQ center and the embattled executive director who has a mountain of complaints and grievances filed against her. The community needs to know those things, and they want to know those things. And, this involves issues of accountability. And we're happy to do that sort of work because it's not being done. It's really a desert. It truly is a desert and is not being done. Could you ask that second part of the question about, I forget what your second part of your question was.
Focusing on the idea that this issue has been resolved, or when sort of bigger outlets just don't include or platform stories of queer people.
Yeah, I think what happens is a lot of news cycles are so rapid nowadays compared to just, say, 5 years ago. And I think a lot of people I think there's a couple of factors. One, I think it's like they just forget about it because I think everybody is so overwhelmed because, staffs are smaller, but they still have to cover all these things. And so I think it's just out of sight, out of mind of what's getting the attention today. Squeaky wheel gets the grease, so to speak. But I think also a lot of these newsrooms don't have anybody covering the queer community. So by default, those stories are not going to be covered. And also a lot of these newsrooms don't have anybody queer on board. So by default, those stories aren't going to be covered. So it's almost a recipe for disaster. They're not going to be covered because there's nobody following it. There's nobody part of the community. And the people who are in charge, the editors and stuff, I think this is fair to say because the data will support this. They really don't care because the stories aren't being done. They'll cover everything else. And when I mean everything else, literally everything and the kitchen sink, but not the queer community. And so, we're really doing that service, that public service that the community deserves and requires. And we're happy to do that. And we're looking forward to growing and scaling that in a bigger and better way.
This reminds me why so in the HIV community, for those who don't know, I was a senior editor at thebody.com and The Body Pro and a podcast host of International AIDS Society. And one of our biggest tenets is the meaningful involvement of people living with AIDS and HIV, which means that people who are affected by issues should be driving them, should be at the forefront of how they're discussed and reported. I don't want to hear how Nana, who's not living with HIV, thinks about HIV because she doesn't know what she's talking about. And I think that this gets to a part of what you're saying here. And I think this, circling back before you joined, Tre'vell mentioned that a lot of these spaces aren't necessarily safe for people. And so then it becomes that question of like, how do we actually get into those spaces that aren't built for us and that don't want to include us and that are actively erasing us? And I'm going to stop my diatribe here to move on to something that actually speaks about some of the work that you and Joseph with Lookout and Q News have done, collaborating on a similar initiative that tracks legislation and election campaigns that are built on anti-LGBTQ agendas. And I say similar to the work that Tre'vell is doing with Trans News Initiative. So could you tell us about why this is important, not just for queer people, but to constitutional principles like equal protection under the law of freedom of speech? Gentlemen.
You want me to, oh, Joseph, you want to start with that? Do you want me to start or?
Fishbowl, have a conversation, the two of you.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, well, first off, okay, so let me give a bit of like what QNN, what Queer News Network was and what it is. Sorry, because it's still continuing. We're having a hell of a time trying to fund it, for whatever reason. But essentially, it's Phillip and I, we met in Long Beach once during because it was IRE 2 years ago. Oh my God, yeah, whatever, so many years ago. And we said, God, we really need to we need to get queer news outlets that don't have the resources, that want to be able to cover down ballot races, but they don't cover down ballot races because they just don't have the resources, they don't have the staff, they don't have the collective knowledge to do down ballot races. But also these papers of record in states also aren't covering it from the lens that will actually affect our communities. We need to get these newsrooms that have the audience, that are within the audience, to do it. And so Lookout, we were able to, fundraise $30,000 to put together a website, fund 10 different interns across 10 different newsrooms in 9 different states to cover down ballot races for the general election. And it was incredibly successful. I mean, out of this, we had so little money to do this and so little time to do it. And we had a ridiculous amount of pickup. We had amazing views on it. And people were like, wow, this is really powerful. This really works if you're able to focus on down ballot issues and down ballot candidates through a really powerful news lens, not just like these are the queer people running for something, but these are the people who are getting funded by something who is a queer person or who may not be a queer person, or these anti-trans initiatives or anti-queer initiatives are being funded by this person. Here's how we're able to find that. And it was incredibly successful. We've been trying to pitch it to a number of different people to prop it up for this time, but nobody's biting because the DEI is in the room with us. And so it's been really difficult. And so it's incredibly important though, because essentially what we saw and what we need to see right now is we saw news outlets that have a specific community, have a specific readership that may not be reading the Tampa Bay Times, that may not be reading the New York Times for various trust issues, but they trust their local queer publication. And they're willing to read the arts and culture from them if they're willing to know where to go out on a Friday and Saturday night from these ostensibly bar rags. Maybe they'll also trust the news that's coming out of that. And so giving it the same kind of editorial guidance and editorial eye that you would have at, Texas Tribune, at Arizona Republic, at any other major publication. You give it the same eye and the same care, but you do it with a specific focus and mission in mind. Will that community get civically engaged? And we saw that they did. And it's unfortunate that, even after we brought Queer News Network under Lookout, we've been having a really, really shitty time getting it funded again. It's something that, we've seen works. But yeah, so Phillip, you can jump in.
I can babble a little bit. No, it was a great project. I mean, first of all, Joseph deserves an enormous amount of appreciation and claps and whatnot, because this was the first time a project of this sort had ever been done in the U.S. and this was 2024, and that's kind of amazing and great, but also it's kind of shameful and embarrassing, like 2024 and this hadn't been done yet. And I think it kind of just goes back to this theme that queer topics, queer journalism, queer writers, we're treated like we don't exist. When it's time for Pride, oh, we're going to do that ubiquitous gay pride story. Do we still need gay prides today? The laziest headline, the laziest stories possible. I mean, just lazy, lazy, lazy. We're talking about doing, and let's be frank also, mainstream media, the down ballot, local elections, if you will, local stuff we were covering. Mainstream's not covering this. I mean, they're just not, period, full stop. Or they're giving us some kind of a whitewash, or I wouldn't even say like a Cliff Notes version. It's a very, let's say, sanitized version of what's
Or
going
it's
on.
very like 30,000 foot, right?
Well,
Like
exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
like we're
Yeah.
talking about school boards or something like that and the effects of school board elections. And maybe a story will come out from a large scale publication talking about there's like a number of different school boards across a number of different states that are like being funded by Moms for Liberty or Turning Point Action or something like that. And like that was a general overview because as we know what happens to national news, if it doesn't happen locally, it'll never become nationally. But the problem is that what's happening nationally, I do think national news is sometimes covering this pretty okay. They're just covering it from too high up.
Right.
And so when we get down to the local level, people just aren't seeing the trends. They're not
They're not
seeing
connecting the dots. And the dots, I mean, the dots are all right there in front of you. Again, it's not like you have, I mean, they're literally laying there on the table. Just take your pencil and connect them. And I think what's also important to mention is I remember 2024 election. I remember there were some school board, city council elections happening in say in our region, and there were some anti-queer people who were on the ballot. And I remember some mainstream publications just completely sanitized their campaign, like, oh, so and so was against, pride flag hanging in the city. That was how they kind of encapsulated this person who was a horrific candidate. And so it's still easy when it's done, it's still screwed up and it's still not done appropriately. And props to us, and hooray for us, clap, clap, clap. We had queer publications, we had queer writers, we had queer editors, we had interns who were either part of the community or friends of the community. So we knew it, all this stuff. We also knew what the dog whistles are, and that's a huge problem with mainstream and legacy publications. They just regurgitate these dog whistles, and they don't take the time to explain to readers what they are when it is so easy, and that's a EASYYYYYY to do. But I get this pushback from editors. We don't want to be biased. It's not. If a KKK member is running for your school board, you call them a KKK member. But if the person is blatantly homophobic and wants gay people erased, that's biased. I don't get it. You're constantly fighting against this homophobia ingrained in legacy and mainstream newsrooms. We didn't have any of that static. We had none of that white noise. We just like, here's what we're going to do. Here's the thing. Boom. And readers appreciated it. It's unfortunately, like Joseph said, that project should be, should be magnanimously funded to continue to go, because we know it's getting worse. It's getting worse. And even if you don't read about it, even if you don't think about it, guarantee it's happening at these school boards. It's happening in these elections. Here in Long Beach, allegedly gay-friendly city, we had a Moms for Liberty candidate running for one of the local school board seats. And unfortunately, when her candidacy was covered, one of the local newsrooms covered it more from the perspective of, how's this Moms for Liberty candidate running? What's she up against? I mean, what is she standing for? They covered it from the perspective of, oh, the teachers union is dumping all this money into the other candidate. So it was almost being framed as if it was this pro-union as opposed to, God, you missed the point. Here is this homophobic person who wants to ban gay books, but you're focused on how much money the school union, the teachers union gave the other candidate. I'm not saying that shouldn't be covered, but you completely missed the lead. You completely missed the point. And, then we have to kind of come in and try to clean that mess up. But, genie's out of the bottle. I shouldn't say the genie, the devil's out of the bottle, or whatever's out of the bottle. It's hard to put that back in because you can't. And so we're constantly facing that. I'm sure Joseph faces the same thing in Arizona. We're constantly going, ugh, there was a screw up. Ugh, there was a screw up. Ugh. I mean, not by us, but by them. Like, they got it wrong. They got it wrong. They got it wrong. They got it wrong. I mean, it's a mess.
There's one thing I just want to add to that, and I'll put a period on this, which is there's also been talk within this room about the need to have queer people in your newsrooms, to have them part of the editorial team, just kind of existing within there. I agree with that wholeheartedly, because that's the reason why we did QNN, is we wanted to make sure that queer people, especially when it came to the interns, we wanted queer queer students to know that they didn't have to abide by the objective standard of journalism in order to cover their community. They can cover it and cover it well. However, the one thing I will push back on that I consistently hear in queer spaces, specifically around journalism, is that this community is the only ones who need to cover this, right? My main reporter is a cisgender, straight, white man, right? He turned down a job in Puerto Rico because he cared so much about covering our community. And he is doing a phenomenal job at building trust, at caring, at doing the work. I don't think newsrooms need to think of this as just a hiring problem. It's an ethics problem within their structure, right? Is like, I covered prisons for 10 years. I covered the military for 5 years. Have I been incarcerated in a prison? No. Have I been incarcerated? Have I served in the military? No. It didn't stop me from doing my job and doing it well. And so that is a big problem that we're also seeing is the conversations around how to cover queer communities is always a hiring issue. It's not. It's actually an internal issue.
You're right. I want to just add on to that. You're exactly right, Joseph. I know he and I've talked a bunch about this. Newsrooms aren't. Joseph got a reporter who was enthusiastic to jump onto this beat. And it's unfortunate that more reporters aren't like that. And it's also unfortunate that newsrooms don't do more mentoring or training because there probably are other reporters who want to do that, but they're like, give me some guidance, give me some help. But they don't get that. So then it's not there. So it's again, here's another problem where just, people aren't being sensitive to training these people. They're saying, hey, do you want to cover this? Do you want to cover this? They're not making an effort to want to cover it. So because it's not even an effort to cover the community, everything collapses underneath it. But you and I, again, Joseph talked a lot about that, and exactly right. Props to him for, jumping on board, wanting to do that. We need more folks like that. Because the fact is, we're only, 10% of the population, whatever the number is. The overwhelming majority is not us. We've got to find ways to get those folks involved, but there's enormous obstacles and brick walls and things trying to get through. But, walls can be broken down. You can dig around them, tunnel over them. Those are things, but it certainly is a challenge. I digress. Sorry.
Real quick on that point, because I think you made a good point on what's happening in newsrooms and mentorship. There's not. It used to be that there were tiers of journalists, and you could go to somebody who was senior and get advice from them. This is the problem with media consolidation: is that there are not as many people in the newsrooms anymore, and a lot of those people who have lots of experience have been bought out, have retired. The institutional knowledge that was once there isn't there anymore, and that's why a lot of people should be really looking at a lot of what's happening in the media consolidation world very closely, because it's a part of the broader conversation too of how the conversations are being narrowed, and who's covering your news. Where in stations now, there's some markets where one station group owns all the stations. So like, what's the message that's being sent out? We need to be looking at that very closely, and people should be very aware of when they hear that big conglomerates are merging, it's not good for you.
And in the interest of time, we're going to go for about 8 more minutes. Jireh, I want you to say what you're going to say, and if you could speak about intersections of race, language, and queerness as well in your current response, but go off.
Yeah, thank you. I think that Phillip and Joseph opened up a really meaty conversation right there. And I think that one thing I want to say is that covering queer issues is like covering any other beat. It really is not as hard as people think it is. And I think that there have been times where I'm reading through city documents and it's over 100 pages long. And sometimes that is even more challenging than going to talk to someone that I've maybe never met someone from their community before, right? So I think when it comes to covering queer issues, I want to help us demystify it, and have the courage to go and speak to people. And one of the things that you all have mentioned is like media consolidation. There were a couple staff writers at them who were laid off. Hire them. Shout out to James Factora and all those amazing writers and reporters who were laid off. I think that when we're thinking about race, language, and queerness, oftentimes we actually need to look at queerness maybe in the same way that we think about race. And hear me out. I think that, like other ethnic communities, queer people have been segregated in society. We also have like unique words and lexicon that we use amongst ourselves that isn't broadly understood by mainstream culture. So much of like ballroom culture and lexicon, like slay and you ate and all this stuff comes from like Black trans women who are in the ballroom scene, and now it's kind of been, absorbed into the mainstream or taken up or appropriated by a lot of Gen Z slang, right? And so I wish that more people could kind of see us as like a unique community that needs the same amount of care that when you're covering other like immigrant communities and you're learning a new language or you're learning a new culture, because that's the same exact thing with covering queer and trans people. Um, and when it comes to kind of this applying similar standards, I think we just have to look at this objectively as journalists. It's like, do you call that person an anti-abortion activist? Then maybe you need to also call someone else who's saying similar rhetoric around trans people an anti-trans activist. We have to name things as they are. We cannot try to I think as journalists, we should all be trying to say things as they are and speak the truth. And part of that is not trying to cloud or try to hide things, right? And so I also want to bring up the fact that I am pretty monolingual, but I grew up speaking Mandarin as my first language. I grew up in a predominantly immigrant community. Coming out was really hard in the place that I grew up. There are a lot of intersecting issues between covering uh, queerness as it relates to immigrant and other communities of color. And I want to bring up one specific example where I felt like there was a failure of like national media in covering some of the protests that were happening in like Dearborn, Michigan, which is known as one of the most populated by Arab Americans in the Midwest. And there were a lot of stories covering how Muslim communities were joining forces with the Christian right to protest the inclusion of LGBTQ curriculum. And at the very end of one national story I read, there was like a tiny mention that there was a gay Muslim teacher suing a charter school for firing him over his sexuality. But nobody thought to like interview this man or feature him in a story, because there are queer Muslim people. I have a lot of queer Muslim friends, but just because you don't happen to know them doesn't mean that they don't exist, right? And um I think that we also at the same time don't want to impose a Western framework of queerness onto other cultures. There have always been queer or third gender or two-spirit people that exist in indigenous cultures. And then when it comes to covering trans people, we have to consider like, why are we always featuring the same archetype of a white family with young children who are trying to get access to hormones or puberty blockers when there isn't the same moral panic around the homeless trans youth who do not have a supportive family, right? And we are not covering that with the same sort of moral panic and intensity. So I think that for me, my suggestion is like, these are a lot of meaty topics. Like, you might be overwhelmed, like, oh my gosh, like I'm doing horrible. A very easy way to start is just go to your local LGBT center. You'll meet everyone that we're talking about in this conversation right here. Take a voguing class. Like, all these LGBT centers offer free wellness courses. Like, go take a voguing class. You might get humbled and realize, dang, this is really athletic. And but you'll meet so many people. And the most important thing is just that you're humanizing trans and queer people in a way that isn't just flattening these communities into like victims and heroes, right? We want to go beyond these types of like narratives and stereotypes. So that's my advice to folks who might be walking away. I want you to feel empowered to like do this work. I led a very similar kind of like uh uh I guess training for Pointer about just like how to cover trans people and spot this misinformation. So those resources are available out there. And I think that whatever training you have covering whatever beat you have can be easily applied to covering queer beats or queer communities, and that's all I wanted to say.
Thank you. And just if you could all share the best way to contact you in the answered Q&A question. And I do believe that this panel recording will be shared afterwards. For our final question before we open up to the Q&A, I'm going to ask Kay if you could speak about accountability and how do we keep ourselves and each other accountable to the communities we should be serving?
Yeah. I mean, I think this is a really important question, in part because of everything that everyone has been talking about around the erosion of trust in national news and the failure of major legacy organizations to really focus on queer communities, right? Is like local reporters, community newsrooms, folks who are writing specifically by to and for queer communities have a lot of trust. And I think something that we've been seeing as especially as the trans indie press explodes, for instance, is that there's a real resource gap in coverage, right? Like a lot of the folks at large organizations and newsrooms don't know how to cover queer communities, but they know how to cover state houses. A lot of the folks in like these newer, smaller startup publications and the queer press might be covering a state house bill for the first time, and they know how to cover the community inside out, but they don't necessarily know how to navigate the legislation. And that's like conversations that I have all the time in my role at the Trans Journalists Association, is trying to help people to like understand and navigate those landscapes. But because we have the trust as the people who like care, who've been present, who've been covering the community for years and years, I think it's extra incumbent on us to make sure that everything we cover is correct, like fully factually correct. One of the huge things I've been seeing in trans news, right, is that there's a lot of eagerness to cover the things that we're just not getting news about them from other places. But sometimes we just end up like we don't have as big of fact-checking teams. We don't have legal. We don't have all the resources that help us make sure everything's correct. And so I end up seeing headlines and stories that make trans people think they have lost rights that they have not yet lost. And so I think that's something we need to have a really clear eye on as journalists and hold each other accountable to within the community of sort of news and storytellers, is like we need to make sure that we are absolutely correct. Like we cannot just be righteous and fired up and angry about what is happening to our communities. We also have to be fully correct. If I read a story and I think that I cannot cast a vote with my current ID because someone has overstated the degree and function of a voter ID law and hasn't mentioned that in the state I live in, there is a law that says you legally are not allowed to question someone about their ID at the polls no matter what, like that is a journalistic failure, and that is a failure to our communities. And so I think we all need to be incredibly careful, incredibly conscious. And if you're in a more resource newsroom or a journalism support organization, you need to be thinking about how can we use these resources that we have, these fact-checking resources, these legal resources, and connect with some of these smaller community publications that are looking for ways to make sure that we're doing these stories justice for our communities. So I think big picture, like thinking about ways we can collaborate to have accountability within our community and resource across all sorts of publication types as we're trying to fill these gaps in news and in the focuses on LGBTQ communities in publications. All of that is super, super important. So I think, the Trans Journalists Association can be a resource for that. A lot of the other journalism support organizations have started producing really good tools, but that's something that I think anyone in this room should be thinking about, like, how can we do this? How can we put our heads together and like make sure that we're building the sort of resources, toolkits, and collaborations that foster this sort of work being absolutely correct.
Thank you so much. And now we open our Q&A. And Ken, I'm going to ask you to consider this first. How do you fund independent queer publications, considering that today's readers often reject both advertising and paywalls? Thoughts on that?
I don't know. No, I'm kidding. If I figured that out, my God, I'd be a very wealthy person, wouldn't I? This actually, it sounds more like a question for Joseph. Um, I, I, you know, I, the traditional funding streams for media don't exist anymore in the way that they did. So, I know it's a frustration for a lot of people to pay for journalism, but it is the only way a lot of organizations are left to pay for employees. So I don't know that there is a way around that. With big media, social media sites, taking so much of our content and getting it for free, and us now becoming so reliant on them to drive our traffic. It's like we've given, and they're making money off of us, and they're giving us very, very, very little back. Um, you know, I we need to blow up the system. And a free press, I agree, should be free, but people forget that, you used to pop a quarter into a machine on the corner and pay for your newspaper. And you used to pay for a yearly subscription to get it thrown into your driveway. Some people didn't have access over the air, so they would pay for cable just so they could have access. We've been behind a paywall, all of our lives for most of us. So it's not a new concept. Um, I keep thinking of all of those ads I get for like track all the subscriptions that you have and get rid of the ones you don't. You forget about all the stuff that you have, and yeah, it does cost money, but it is funding journalism. So I'm not supportive of a paywall, but we got to find some way to support journalism and pay for people, because these folks do a lot of work. They put their lives in danger, and increasingly, they are the ones that are the target of a lot of the attacks from people who don't like what you have to say. It goes all the way up to the president of the United States. We need to, pay people that are willing to be brave enough to stand up and do the reporting and do the work to cover our issues.
And real quick, I'm just going to hop in and say, if you would like to fund queer journalism, you can donate to any of the folks' outlets, and we will be including where you can donate in the resource guide to any of these news outlets and places like the Trans Journalists Association, NLGJA, AJA, AAJA. But please do support your local queer journalists and news outlets.
Yes, and if you have questions, please keep them coming. I just want to say that I believe in paywalls, and like it's like not tipping your bartender to me if you're not willing to fund the journalism, which is just the ultimate sin. I'm going to open that question up to others on the panel. Joseph, if you want to weigh in right away, or Tre'vell. Oh, Jireh, please.
Okay. So I feel conflicted about the paywall just because I'm a huge public media nerd, and I am very grateful that I'm going to be starting at Oregon Public Broadcasting next in August. So I think that we're really in a tough place, right? We're trying to figure out, how do we compete for attention online when there's streamers, YouTubers, and Substacks all crowding the same space. And I think, just going back to what Kay was saying, we have to make sure that we do our job as journalists, and we fact checked, and that we are not spreading misinformation. Um, and I think one of the biggest things that I want to highlight, that is just about, investing, is not just like, like Phillip was saying, just that one Pride Month story that gets published every year. It's about long-term looking at, okay, how do we cover queer people as a whole across our newsroom? And then how do we maybe invest in like an internship or like a fellowship that helps to support this queer person? I personally have been working at over probably like half a dozen newsrooms in the past 4 years, because I was hopping from fellowship to fellowship. And I have produced a body of work that I'm very, very proud of. And I have won, local awards, and NLGJA, shout out to you guys, gave me an award for covering trans people. But throughout that, it's just been so hard to get a full-time permanent job. And I think that, just going back to media consolidation, I think that queer and trans people are the first people impacted by media consolidation, and that we need that, like, we like local newsrooms, but especially queer and trans publications, we are experiencing like a huge financial crisis, and we need people to invest in us. So I don't know what that looks like, but it looks like maybe applying for foundations, getting more people to donate to queer news. We have to find a way to meet that gap. And we also need to just give queer and trans people jobs in newsrooms. Like we are like it definitely sucks to be told to like lead a training, but then also not have any like stable employment, like that has been the reality that I've been in for the past like 4 years. And I think speaking up also about queer and trans issues can sometimes put you in a box. And so the 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 challenge of being a queer and trans journalist right now is like, we want to do our work. And then we're also worried like, well, will these public officials not respond to me because I'm out, because they don't want to talk to us. So I think those are all things that if you are a leader in a newsroom, that you need to consider when you are thinking about investing in queer news and making a supportive environment for your reporters who are queer and trans.
Thank you. And in interest of time, I'm going to ask participants to limit your time to 2 minutes. Kay, I'm pulling you back into the queue. So come, please.
So I want to take this paywall question and zoom out a little bit. And also, I think, shift a bit to what Alina has asked, which is, to me, a piece of the problem, right? So we have this question about paywalls, right? But we also have this big picture, massive change in how people are consuming information. And it's, the media consolidation is a huge problem and a huge piece of this and probably caused by it. But we also, like, people are increasingly expecting that information is free. More than that, the way that AI functions at this point means that if you are writing a story as a journalist, a lot of times the information that you include in that story is showing up in another place without citation, without attribution. People are finding our information as journalists in very different places. This has huge ramifications for the industry, for figuring out how we're monetizing our work, making our work sustainable, and it's scrambling everyone. Like this is a major question in the whole journalism landscape for everybody right now. I think what's cool about where queer news is positioned right now is that a lot of our organizations are young enough and flexible enough that we can think of ways to adapt to this that aren't necessarily encumbered by, like, we're 100 years old. What the heck do we do? How do we upend our entire, like, revenue model if the paywall's no longer working because everyone's getting our information from a ChatGPT summary, right? And so I think, like, there's no easy answer to these questions, but I do think it's also helpful to zoom out and think about this in terms of, like, what are the things that we are providing to our community? Like, what are the events that we're providing? How are we connecting people with information? How are we building, like, resources and information and civic participation in ways that can build, like, potential financial relationships, potential sponsorships, things beyond just this sort of, like, very rote understanding of you hand somebody a dollar and they hand you back a piece of news, because that's just not how people understand information at all, period, anymore. And so I think, like, the more we as journalists can think about that, it's a problem in queer news and reaching, like, specific communities with our news just as much as it's a problem in the bigger landscape. And if we can be creative about that, we might, crack some sort of code for everybody.
Thank you. And Joseph, I know you were on this as well. Mr. Vince, please.
Yeah, well, I mean, so we don't actually charge for events. And so
Oh,
no, so the way that we have kind of envisioned this and what we are trying to do is telling philanthropy that they need to step up, right? We are an accountability news outlet that does civic engagement. You cannot make money off of this, right? You cannot do that anymore. We are not entertainment. We don't have an entertainment portfolio. We are not a CNN that has an entertainment arm. We are not even like a Vice that had like the HBO arm. Like there is just no way that we can make money off of subscribership or even sponsorship alone. And the reason being is because that same survey that I talked about that made us focus and pivot to solutions also said that people trusted news outlets less if they had advertising in their papers. And so what we have done is that we have just started doing advertising in our print publication, which pays now for itself. But what we have also done is we've said 30% paid, the rest is all free advertisement to nonprofits in that we cover, in the region that we cover. And so what we have tried to say in return is like, cool, MacArthur, cool, Knight, and I'll call you out by name right now. Like you fund the millions of dollars for all these other news publications. You give them millions of, like, cool, AJP. Like you care about local news, then care about this sect of local news, that there is actually an audience that will like engage with this, that has impact. We've proven it. Other news outlets have proven it. So invest in it. I mean, there's a fantastic white paper that came out not too long ago, and I'll have to share it maybe to like the blast up to the people who are part of this. But essentially saying that news outlets need to find their thing. Bloomberg is able to sell a terminal for $30,000 a year. Semaphore has a chat that like the Fortune 500s are a part of that. You know, Axios and Politico has a subscription model meant for politicos. Um, as if we are really doing the model that we say we are doing, which is accountability news, there's a reason why ProPublica doesn't have a paywall. It's because they are funded heavily by philanthropy. Philanthropy needs to step up.
Yes, and I love that I'm the only one who says ProPublica.
I just want to jump in
Yes.
1 second, just kind of piggyback on what Joseph said, and we've talked about it quite a bit also. Yeah, there's been an exclusion of queer media in the philanthropy realm. You don't see us funded really at all. There's some tokenism going on, but it's there's a lot of lip service paid. It's not genuine, because when it comes down to it, we just don't have to have, we just don't happen to have. I mean, I'll have to, when we were doing the Queer News Network, I happened to be speaking to somebody on a call who was super duper duper excited about, hey, I'm the right person you should be talking to. This is amazing. I'm so glad we're talking. This is so cool. Hit me up. We can do some funding for you. That person ghosted us. Didn't return any text messages. They just completely just ghosted us. And it was just like, I remember who that person was. I know who that person is. It's just, they have to step up, and they're not stepping up. And there's, again, it's really a shame. And you can easily look through and see who's not doing that. Again, it's another way to kind of, erase us and pretend that we don't exist. So, we do a thing now when we talk with folks who claim that they want to get involved. Because I found out the hard way that a lot of these groups we were talking to, they were just using talking to me as a checkbox, that they could go back to their supervisor. Hey, we engaged with the gay community. They never had any interest whatsoever to do anything. But they could go back to their boss and say, hey, we checked the box. I talked to the gay guy. So now when we talk to folks, we're like, hey, here's some milestones we have. Here are some benchmarks. And most of those folks like retract immediately, like a tortoise back into the shell. So they were never really interested in the very beginning. It was all just for show. And, I think some of those folks need to start being called out for that. Because they're saying one thing publicly and then privately it's just not happening. They're phonies. They're just phonies.
And I would
Anyway.
like to name them all at all times. I don't. Well, no, I do, but I know it's harder for publishers. Tre'vell, I'm going to jump to this question here from Odette. What would you advise as a concrete framework or checklist for news leaders to ensure that trans voices, trans expertise are authentic, authentically, oh wow, I can't speak suddenly, authentically part of the coverage, and part of the coverage culture, and bias is dismantled?
Great question, Odette. So I think there's like two ways to approach this, right? There's the organizational and institutional kind of approach, which requires a particular kind of investment. And then there is kind of the individual specific journalist or editor approach. I think on the institutional and organizational side of things, the Trans Journalists Association does newsroom trainings. We can get your folks together. Okay, we can provide, some structured training and workshop opportunities to help you and your team practice, right, what it looks like to be concerned about coverage about trans rights and communities, in a way that dismantles bias, in a way that ensures kind of an accurate and nuanced reflection of trans experiences. We also have a host of resources on our site that can be incorporated into your organization's standards of coverage, right? We have a style book and coverage guide that is broken down and searchable, so you can incorporate it that way. We have a workplace resources guide, right, which speaks to how your workplace can become a more inclusive and welcoming space for trans people as well as every one else. So I think of that on the organizational side. On the individual side, I think, you know, for me as a Black trans journalist, my commitment to this work has always had to transcend the outlet that I am working for, right? Which is to say, I have had to, you know, go out of my way to do the necessary education and fact finding and community building that would allow my work to be what I want it to be and have the impact with the communities I am concerned about in the ways that I want to. And so I say that to say, you know, are pursuing on an individual level professional development, right? In ways to shift your coverage, your own personal reporting framework, right? Your own personal editing framework. There are also a host of resources from us at the Trans Journalists Association, as well as other organizations, to support that work, right? It's attending certain workshops and panel discussions at conferences, right? It is going the extra mile to, we're developing a training program that individuals can apply to and self-select to, that'll be happening in Miami at the end of this year. I think a lot of what we have to think about in terms of how we as journalists can show up appropriately in this moment, both for our newsrooms as well as for our communities. It really is, to circle back to some of the other points that have been made, it really is about following through with some of those foundational principles that we used to talk about in J school, or that we used to talk about, you know, in newsrooms and in those mentorship development opportunities, which is about, you know, hitting the ground, being out in a community in advance of an issue happening, right? How are you thinking about, are you tracking, you know, your sources? Are you tracking and paying directly, like, specific attention to, you know, how many trans people have we interviewed this year? Are we interviewing trans people about issues that impact trans people, or are we prioritizing other voices outside of trans community to speak for trans people? Right? You know, are you interviewing trans and non-binary people about issues that have nothing to do with our gender identities and sexualities? You know, because we are experts about other things as well. But these are the same kinds of conversations and questions we should always be asking about a host of communities, not just trans community. And so I feel like a lot of our work at TJA is trying to remind people that really all we're asking for is you to do those foundational things that we have always said that we do in this industry. It doesn't change, as everyone has said, just because the focus of attention is on trans people.
Yes, because trans people are people first, just like anyone else. Thank you so much for this, for delivering the final word. Thank you so much for attending this, and to our panelists for your excellent conversation. Amani, I return the mic to you.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the Maynard Institute, I just want to thank all of you for being here. And personally, this is the first webinar panel discussion I've been able to put together in my role in the Maynard Institute, and I couldn't be happier with the lineup that we've had today, and with Juan Michael Porter as our moderator, Juan Michael Porter II as our moderator. This is definitely not the last time that I'm going to be seeing any of you, but I want to make sure everybody who is in attendance knows. Please go follow all of the folks here across social media. Sign up for Google alerts, put them in your, sign up for their newsletters, put that newsletter in your inbox, and donate wherever you can to fund all of these beautiful initiatives and things that are really just diversifying our coverage and giving us a truer, better picture of what we look like in this nation. Because when you look at all of the folks here, they exist every single day, not just during the month of June. So let's just all keep it going. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And I will see all of our panelists in your email inbox shortly to thank you again.
Thank you to Amani for putting this together and bringing us together. What an
Thank you so
amazing
much.
lineup.
Thank you so much. Yeah, us queer Muslims, we're rare, but we're out here. I thank you so much, Jireh, for recognizing us.
Yeah, shout out.
And to anybody who had questions, we've noted your questions down, and if you didn't get your questions answered, or you know, all of that will be in the forthcoming resource guide, which will be available with the recorded webinar on all of our websites. So follow along, stay tuned, and we will see you later. Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.